So today we are going to talk about, and also thank you for the title, because I don't think I proposed this title, but this one is much more effective than the one I actually propose, and allow me to think more about this specific topic that I would like to talk about today, which is the problem of temporality within this specific literary genre. So, literary dialogue in Modernism, ein Versuch, both, so the reference is both to Lukács' theory of the novel, within the subtitle says ein Versuch. This is not a theoretical theory, this is an attempt to talk, theoretically speaking, about what is a literary dialogue, how does it work, what is its shape, what is its function, and why it's literary, what is dialogue. So it is an attempt to, also it aims at defining a theoretical framework of the genre itself. But is more an attempt to study literary text and to see how this, from this hermeneutical approach, we can identify some formal features to define the genre itself. Also, the very first study, which I never recall, the name Udo Firzel, the dialogue was a Versuch, an attempt. It was an 1895 book about dialogue, so it doesn't go beyond 1895, of course, but that was also an attempt, ein Versuch, to define, historically speaking, aesthetically speaking, and also formally speaking, the genre. So more later. So just to define our framework for today. So if you were expecting a super theoretical lecture, not exactly, but we are going also in that direction. Why dialogues today? Do you know, besides, well, after the announcement by Professor Van den Bosch, any dialogue in 20th century literature? I guess that you have to think about it, right? Because it's not something that comes out immediately. There are actually many dialogues. Not all of them are very good, aesthetically speaking, but they do exist. I would like to start from this quote by Franco Moretti in Romanzo di Formazione. Of course, it's a book about the novel, well, specifically about the Bildungsroman, but I think it's pretty effective. So Franco says, what happens when a symbolic form faces a problem that is unable to solve? This definition, argues Franco Moretti, presupposes the idea that forms are essentially problem-solving mechanisms, capable of dissolving the tensions and paradoxes generated by social conflict and historical change. In the 20th century, at a point, dialogues had to face this issue. Can the genre itself, the dialogue, be able to face problems that it's not actually able to solve? This is one of the reasons why I guess, well, why I propose and I argue that the genre is slowly disappearing. The dialogue is not anymore able to face aesthetic and social issues. Because other genre, novel, poetry, also essayism, are doing what the dialogue was supposed to do in ancient philosophy, and a little bit in Renaissance, in the Middle Age, but mostly the age of dialogue is in the Renaissance, from 16th century up to, well, late 17th, early 18th century. We have still some philosophical important dialogues in the 19th century transition, but the genre when the dialogue was able to solve social and mostly rational issues was the Renaissance. In the 20th century, we'll see that after 1910, as you know, things change. Well, after Modernism, of course, things change, and dialogue has to face this aesthetic issue. Some of these dialogues can go through this process, others didn't, and slowly after the 60s, mostly the dialogues disappear, or they just become semiotic games, plays, or commercial books. If you just Google, if you go to Amazon and you look for literary dialogues, there are many dialogues published between 2005 and 2019 in any language. which are mostly, commercial stuff. Nothing important, relevant, or that can be even discussed in a literary discussion. Between 1910 and 1960s, as we will try to argue today, something happens, and especially Dublin, Paul Valéry, is a Paese where probably the most important authors who decide to face this social issue by approaching aesthetic and epistemological elements by means of dialogue. So, framework, time, space, and aesthetics, we are in the 20th century. Roughly something that happens between 1910 and 1960. Well, probably 1970s with the new avant-garde in Italy, also in French. We are in, I'm very sorry, we are in very white, Western, elitarian Western literature. So there are no women. I'm sorry, but that's the sad reality. And they are mostly white guys who wrote dialogues. That's the sad part. Mostly in France, well, as far as I know from the language that I know, France, Germany, Italy, something in Spain, and Anglophone countries, they had some authors who wrote dialogues. I'm sure that in Russia and some Balkanic countries they do have dialogues, but the language doesn't help me out in this case. So time, space, and aesthetics. Aesthetically speaking, we are going through the avant-garde, the 1910, not exactly 11. Well, it's hard to define, but let's use Thomas Harrison titled the 1910 Dissonance of Ontology, and Modernism and the avant-garde. We are not going to talk about all this stuff. I'm going to focus something between the 1910-11 crisis and the European modernism, and by means of, I guess, temporality. What we are not going to talk about today is we don't want, well, since we will see many literary critics said that dialogue in the 20th century is dead, which is false. I wanted to make a strict line about my topic. So we are not going to talk about dialogues in other genres. There are many dialogues in poetry, in novel, drama, essay, etc. Many, of course, but this is not the topic we're going to talk about today. We are not going to talk about non-fictional dialogues, philosophical dialogues, and interview. I think Professor Martens, who I think is not here, I know Professor Martens? Oh god, that's embarrassing. So he knows a lot about the topic. Lovely essay on Poetics Today, if you are the guy of the literary interview on Poetics Today.
He is the guy.
Okay, he is the guy, so I associate the face in a very embarrassing way. So, okay, so there is also the cultural study issue of the literary interview in the 20th century studies. Very complicated topic that I'm not going to talk about. There are interesting, well, it's complicated for many reasons. One, because we have fictional interviews, literary interviews. The topic is very broad and can be taken on from many perspectives. But so today, these are off topic. Very interesting, but not my cup of tea. What is accepted, actually, are Hebrew forms, as much as their function is aesthetic, epistemological, and foremost non-instrumental. And by that I mean this. There's a beautiful book called L'Entretien Infini di Blanchot by Maurice Blanchot. And at a point, randomly, there are dialogues. In that case, dialogue is not instrumental, in a way that dialogue is thought and used as a specific literary genre in order to talk about other things. When I say non-instrumental, I mean that when people, well, authors use dialogue to talk about other stuff, when it's essentially a semiotic instrument. In this sense, instrumental. Let me think an example. Well, if you pick any novel by I don't know, Cesare Pavese at the point around dialogues. But dialogues are instrumentally part of the novel. It's not an independent genre itself in the novel. Okay? So in that sense, I mean instrumental. So my topic if that makes sense in English. So what I argue is, what I want to study, what I wanted and I will talk with you today is about dialogue as literary genre and foremost as an independent genre. It's interesting to see how dialogue works within other genre, but in this sense we are claiming that dialogue is dead. If not dead, it's not as important as it was in the past, but it still has something to say. So that's why I chose this restricted path. So the bibliography is very... there are many other studies that I could mention. I can count on my hands. These are Suzanne Guilloux and Vittorio Hösle are the most important essay, one for the literature part, the other one for the philosophical part. And they both state that dialogues in the 20th century, literally speaking, is dead. This is the only Italian work that I was able to find, Antonio Castore. Never heard about him. Not sure if he's still, if he's an academic or not, still nowadays. But also, he says, European dialogue from the 16th to the 20th century, and at the very end of the essay says in the 20th century there are very few examples of dialogues, but mostly they don't exist, which is, again, false. We can say that they're not interesting, maybe, they're not aesthetically readable, but they do exist and they actually have something to say. What I found very interesting, besides the Guilloux and Hösle statements, is that Labarthe and Jean-Luc Nancy says, they talk about le dialogue des genres and they talk about also dialogues, but they never state anything about the 20th century, which I found really interesting. And also then Hessner, probably the most interesting theoretical essay about the dialogue, it's very short but very effective, also states that dialogue in the 20th century doesn't exist, and if it does, we shouldn't pay attention to it. This is the Damnat's memory. Post Rudolf Hirzel, the dialogue, where he makes a very long history of the genre until late 19th century. If you're interested in more bibliography, I can send it out. It's not usually very good or not very useful for the topic, but I can give it to you. Rediscovery, very recently for American Studies, really recently, Americans in Germany, I guess, Tim Kinzel, and these are Germans, but there are many Americanist scholars who work on imaginary literary dialogues in English and American and philosophy. So recently people have been discussing again the topic, and the last book is another interesting edited volume, Dialogue Across Media, and it discusses what I didn't want to discuss, how dialogue goes through media. By media they mean other literary genre, but not only the literary, also other genre, like internet, for example. Like journalistic essay, TV show, cinema, music, everything. It costs $200, so it's hard to eyeball it, but it's really expensive. So recently, after 2011, the discussion came out again, but not for European literature. And also, you see, there is this, it's very popular now, these very interdisciplinary studies, especially the intermediate. But on the other hand, the issue, I guess, is that we don't actually focus on literature anymore. Well, specifically for dialogues. Okay. Big names, actually. So, you may like them or not, but these people wrote dialogues. So Lukács, I don't know if you, when I found it out, I was pretty surprised, but Lukács wrote 2 dialogues in the early 20th century. Mikiel Stéka wrote dialogues, Brecht, well, it was published after his death. Durbin, Balavi, Claudel, Alain, Pavese, Céline, Blanchot, Manganelli, there are many other names. Not all of them are super famous, but I think they are all famous. So they're very different texts, but just quantitatively speaking, we have a case study that we can approach and we can decide whether it's valuable or not. Of course, Valery wrote more than 3 dialogues. Also, Claudel, Alain just wrote a few examples. If you want a very a broader list, I can send you out, but that's not the goal of today's lecture. The idea is, do we have a case study to talk about dialogues? Yes, we do. And how do we approach these case study? That's my proposal. I come from kind of a phenomenological tradition. What I found very interesting is the relationship between form, it's kind of a Lukács form, but not from a Marxist side. But as I said, from a philological tradition, so the relationship between life and forms. So vie de forme, l'être et la forme. The idea, the way I see dialogues and literary works is, you can read the first quote. Just the artistic form exercises a sort of animation of different senses, or rather presents itself as a kind of mold, where metaphors from time to time are similar materials that submit to the curve that presses them, thus acquiring unexpected meaning. So this idea that artistic form are within us and they shape our own Weltanschauung. And they have an ontological, immanent function within our vision of things, not in a transcendental way. In a sense, art, as Jean Nash says, argues, art involves an ontology of its own on specific reality conditions. In this sense, dialogue combines, in my view, also in the 20th century, this tension between language and thought through the relationship between argumentation, intersubjectivity, and dialectics in this very ontological hermeneutic way. And this is a very 20th century, of course. If you pick any Plato dialogues or any 16th century dialogues, you see this very rational, dialectic way of investigating the reality. This is something that also 20th century people do, but in a very different way. As I said, after 1910, things change. The aesthetic becomes expression of a fracture of the self, and the ontological status of human beings is at risk. And I see that, especially for the authors that I mentioned and the authors that I want to talk about today, Durbin, Balafi, and Pavese, this becomes a very hermeneutic and ontological issue that I want to discuss by means of dialogues. Yeah, it's kind of a better summary that I wanted to mention before. So what is important? So why dialogue? Why also dialogue? Dialogue also of course they come from the Platonic tradition. So and the Hegelian tradition. So they both dialogue takes on both the metaphysical tradition of Plato's dialogues on the one hand, and the Hegelian dialectic on the other one. And the literary representation involves these metamorphosis of symbolic forms of art, which stands between this dialogism and dialectics on aesthetic level. So I think that this is why it's important. What's important? Why it is interesting to talk about literary dialogues in the 20th century. Literary dialogues allow us to rediscover, discuss, and to argue how metaphysical and dialectic way can be reproduced in the form of art, in a way that novel and poetry cannot do. After 1910, as I said, phenomenological epistemological tradition, but in a way Lukácsian, without this early Marxist view in the Seele und die Formen. It's interesting that it actually starts with this quote about two naked souls who talk to each other. He said they sich sprechen. And what happens after 1910 is this dissonance, this epistemological fracture that I already mentioned of the criticism of the forms that creates this gap between man and reality. And after 1910, any work of art tries to face this issue. What dialogues allow us to do is this is through this semantic plurality. So there are many kinds of dialogues. We can have dialogues, dialogue, part of the Z, because it's kind of interesting that Lukács firstly wrote the dialogues in Hungarian. But it's not interesting because it was Hungarian. So, but what is interesting is part of the Z is a dialogue, and that's like whatever it is conversation. And then in German, because then he translated those works in German, and they became Gespräch, which is something different than dialogue, for two reasons. One, for linguistic reason. Between late 19th century, early 20th century, there is a kind of a German need to use a German expression. So Gespräch is closer to the German root of the language. That's one reason, put the reference, but it's proved by linguistic studies. So Gespräch from gesprochen, so something that is said, talk, on a conversational level, so it's closer to conversational Gespräch. On the other hand, dialogue and is closer to the Greek and Latin tradition. And if you look at any German translation of works, dialogical works, you see that the Plato's dialogues are dialogue, and something that is not Platonic, Latin or Greek, is Gespräch, like 19th century Schlegel's dialogues, which are Gespräch über die Formen, über Dichtung, über Poesie. Hessler says that the dialogue is a written text, conversation is oral text. Hessler says that dialogue is a literary genre, conversation is a social interaction, and I think that the best way to look at this issue is to, by the definition that Kinsel and Milberg propose in their introduction, that the dialogue itself poses problem for its theoretical definition. What is dialogue? It's really hard to see the difference between dialogue, conversation, Gespräch, entretien, colloque, conversation, conversazione. And at least regarding for the European modernism, one way I think to look at this theoretical issue is through temporality. Conversation, dialogue, and Gespräch, they use temporality in a different way. And when we will face the text, I think this will be much easier. The Gespräch is, in a sense, is an oral text. If you look at the Döbling's Gespräche, you can, well, if you do a linguistic study, as has been done, you can see that the language is closer to the oral conversation than other texts, like literary dialogue, which is more rhetorical in a sense, at least until 1945, 1947, when the literary language started to change. Whereas the dialogue is, as I said, is more rhetorical and it involves a different kind of temporality. In this sense, the Gespräch is more immanent. It involves what I argue is a synchronic dimension of the relationship between the two entities, which are usually two or more entities who are involved in the dialogue. And the dialogue instead, as we'll see, especially in Pavese's work, involves more something that we may call it a transhistorical dimension of time. But when we talk about text, this will be much more evident, clear. If you have a better if I had an English translation for Gestasso Messa, I think it's beautiful in Italian. Overwhelmed Greekness sounds awful in English. So among all these titles that I showed you earlier, what is interesting is interesting. It's kind of intuitive, but many of the texts that we are talking about they come from the Greek, Latin mythology, and on the other hand, from the Platonic tradition. In this sense, I agree actually with Jean-Luc Nancy, says that, well, because Nancy earlier said that they don't dialogues don't exist in the 20th century, but when he talks about mythology, he says that mythology is kind of a real ontology of fiction, of representation, a form that accomplishes a fulfilling the ontology of subjective in general. And I think that dialogues works very well in this sense, even though Nancy probably wouldn't agree with me. In this because it's a simple form, dialogue, but it enriches these by using, well, for this group of Gestasso Messa, uses mythological material and the classical tradition, especially the philosophical one, to resolve this conflict between the man and the word, system and environment, in such a way that the self can recover the activity of the soul that shapes the life through form. I don't think it's the case that the most important, both on the aesthetic level and on the epistemic level, are those who deal with Greek mythology. So Pavese, Valery, and Döbling, but also kind of Michael Stetter is, well, not all of these idols, but most of them they deal with Greek mythology, but they were published after his death. So it's also hard to decide on a philological level what actually was the intention of the author when if he had the chance to publish these works. Also these Gestasso Messa, so these reuse of Greek material, I think it's, as I said, useful to talk about two issues. One is the metaphysical level, so how does work the language within dialogues, so the metaphysical issue, and how does it work the representation of reality, and what is the point of this representation. So they both deal with, I think, the two most important issues, at least for me, in my research, which are the metaphysical dimension and the hermeneutical one. So, Döbling in 1910. Döbling actually published die Gespräche mit Calypso über die Musik in 1910 on a literary journal, and then published in a book in 1911. As I said, Gespräche and not dialogues. I didn't write the linguistic reference. So, as I said, there is a 19th century German tradition, very rich. Also, this is why one may argue Lukács, while writing in Germany, at a point wanted to embrace this German tradition by using the terms Gespräch and not making the distinction between Gespräch and Dialog. So there is this very important high philosophical tradition with Schlegel in 19th century with the word Gespräch über Poesie, as said, spoken German root, against dialogue, dialogus or dialogus in Latin and Greek. And also early 20th century, there are many Gespräch über Gedichte by Hofmannsthal, Gespräch über Formen by Rudolf Borchardt. As you see, there is this relation between, again, conversation, because this is actually the translation of Gespräch, and forms in early 20th century static discussion. It is a thematic work. I probably know. I don't know if you have read Döbling's work. If you didn't, it's beautiful. I don't know if it's translating in. It's not translating in English, but if you can read German, you can read it in German. There is a French translation, no Italian, no Spanish. It's pretty an unknown work. I don't know why. Maybe because it's a bad. I think it's beautiful, but who knows? Of course, Döbling is more famous for Berlin Alexanderplatz, which came out later. So it's about music, but of course it's not just about music. It's a conversation between Calypso and a musician, but many other people, they come into the text and they discuss with him, or with her, and by themselves also, in a time conversation. Essentially, this Gespräch is a matrix of the idea of conversation, bent on focusing on the formal dimension of the art word, and verifying its epistemological status in the world of man, by means of music. So music is the starting point through which Darwin tackles this 1910 crisis, as he says in his previous essays. There are time conversation, progressive number. They just, if you haven't read the book, at least you can have a kind of idea of this matrix. There are 10 Gespräche, and erste Gespräch, zweite Gespräch, and sometimes they have a subtitle in Roman type. And I think that this structure is pretty, that's why I said a matrix. It involves three elements: the frame events, so the Gespräch between two people or three people sometimes, or by one people who talks to himself. The literary scenario, the hypertext is Homer, and philosophical discussion about music. What is music? What is the point of music? And how music is related to temporality. This is not interesting. This is very, even though it's a Gespräch, conversation, kind of real life discussion between two people. Characters are mostly persona. Okay, so they have their mask. I don't see any, if you read it, so I can be Calypso, you can be Calypso, he can be Calypso, and you can be the musician, you can be the musician. You don't perceive any, besides the use of pronouns. So we have Z in a formal way, when the musician talks to Calypso, and she says du, duista, so you can perceive this formal structure. But besides that, you don't see any psychological sign that these characters are rounded characters, as Foster would say. They're kind of rhetorical figure of speech, textual entities, who probably aim to become people in this sense, but they still remain on this linguistic level. And mostly they are textual entities that they embody a specific tradition. So Calypso is a hypertextual figure of Homeric tradition. The musician embodies this kind of essence of music. And they deal with the theme of the book, which is music. So what I think that is beautiful. One sec, yes. So what I think is really interesting, and I read the last quote, the music seems to me almost a bridge between being and non-being. It is more unworkable and unreal than anything real. All the point of these 10 Gespräche between the man and the goddess is the relationship between music and existence, between the ontological element that defines human beings, and the temporal dissonance between what I am and what I am not. And you can perceive this embodiment of temporality in the perspective of the mortal and in the perspective of the immortal person. But what happens in this conversation is that this conversation doesn't go any more beyond the synchronic plan. Time, the function that music embodies when they talk about time, doesn't seem to involve any transhistorical dimension, like archetypes of human beings' life. Never. Time and music are. Time is a sound, as we'll see in the next slide. Time is a sound. It can be recorded, but it embodies the instant of his happening through life, and by that I mean through conversation. We'll see in Valéry and Pavese that is different, and this dimension, well, you can perceive that through the dialogue of this time is broader, kind of as Kubrick wrote in an interesting book in 2010, is Unsichtbarkeit der Gegenwart, in a broader presence, and we can say in a broader time. But what I mean by, and in this sense, we receive this negative ontology. In the Funkgespräche, one of the musician talks about this Zusammenhang der Tone, in this fusion of tones. And he says, what links one sound to another one? How does music work? There are images and models for temporal coherence. Do I suffer death? I make death. Death is a manifestation of life, not unlike those that precede it, such as eating, jumping, language. On the one hand, you can read by yourself, the close quote, we perceive this uncertainty principle of art, so which is connected to the dimension of life. How do we link one sound to another one? How do we link our life to another one? This is that's why I'm with a question mark, but as I define a negative ontology. This Gespräch in the island of Ojija remains in this immobile and synchronic time. It doesn't go beyond the answer, the dialectic relationship between the self and the non-self. So the self, the musician, the non-self, Calypso, remains on this, we can say, phenomenological plane. We perceive time, but in the moment. It doesn't go beyond, doesn't give anything that can define our life. And by that, we cannot build anything after the 1910 ruins of history, and we are stuck in this short circuit between the past and the present. So the present of the musician and this immortal, theoretically speaking, past of Calypso, who is supposedly to live forever, but is stuck in this, we can call it also non-time. If you read the text, nothing happens. They talk, but everyone is stuck in this this synchronic dimension of time, where only the music can feel the present, but nothing more than that. 1921. Now we move to Valerie. Now we perceive that the language changes. If you read the text, there's no, in Derlis we don't see any attempt to build, to know. It's mostly about experiencing something, and hopefully from this experience the musician can build a new word, but that phase doesn't happen. Eubalino's dialogue is a dialogue between two people, Phaedrus and Socrates. It's a dual system, and is a relationship between form and philosophy, between building and knowing what is built. On the contrary, well, compared to the other texts, there's a literary, polyphonic, choral, and intersubjective movement. If you're in Derlis, I talk, she talks. Negative ontology, but also negative dialectics. It seems that they are talking to each other. Well, they're talking to themselves and not to each other. Here instead we deal with a real, a very Platonic tradition. There is an action and argumentation, and which goes through from the very beginning to the very end. And for last week, all things are forms. Again, there is a very strong relationship between forms and life, and that is connected to the form for Valery is literally a Weltanschauung, the vision of the world, that men try to grasp, to translate and express to these aesthetic philosophical mechanisms typical of instincts, memory, and association of similarities of the language. At the center of the dialogue, there is the language as a form that shapes our own life. And by life, Valery aims to address the temporality that we perceive, and by perceiving, we build and know the reality. And philosophy is a matter of form. Le Philosophe is a later essay, but is connected to, more than connected to Eubalino's as a matter of form. It is a pursuit of a form capable of merging all the points an individual can have. In Phaedrus and Socrates, as it happens in the Plato's dialogues, they both have a specific vision of the world, and from this, oh my god, my English. And from this conflict, we have the aesthetic and the epistemological elements of modernist dialogues. And this happens also in Eupalinos and also in Pavese's dialogues. And it's not a case that they name their works not Eupalinos, but we have the Dialogue dell'Arte by Valéry. So they go in this Platonic tradition. Also in their essay, which I'm not going to quote in extenso, they always wrote, I'm trying to build this Platonic system, I just read Plato, I wanted to imitate that sense. Of course we can believe it or not, whether they wanted to put themselves in this, or embrace this Platonic tradition, but that was kind of the goal for both Pavese and Valéry, not for Dublin. Plato is kind of an absence name in Dublin essays and works. We perceive this transition. We are in 1920s, then Pavese will publish his work in 1947. Here, the dialogue is connected to a different dimension of temporality, which looks at the future. Building and knowing, so building ein Grund, as I would say, and from which building a new form of knowledge. My instincts, memory, and an association. Again, also this is a very phenomenological work. Phaedrus and if there is another, they do insist on the perception of things and on the definition on, well, it's very well known, but they wanted to name everything in this very rational sense. Is there anything more mysterious than clarity? We own the reality, beauty culminates in the dialectics, the soul, which in Lukács is connected to the fracture of the self, towards the word. Here instead is connected to the ideas of completeness and clearness, to know something that is order, to perceive discourses, construction, the idea of temple, actually there is the idea of time, not temple, the principle of one's own body, and what the soul seeks. It's the idea of time, sorry. There is this attempt to build an idea of time through this perception of reality. And it's something that goes towards the future. It uses, this is a, whereas in the Geschichte, in this very immanent dimension, there is a use of the past in order to build the present. The reuse of mythological tradition and Platonic tradition is meant to build a new different that tries to build something. So this is a very 16th century attempt to use the dialogues. In 16th century, well, the Renaissance dialogue was, we can say literary, but it was a social discourse that was used to discuss higher things, try to build a new form of knowledge. 16th and 18th century. Valéry on the one hand, but also Pavese on the other one, they look at this dimension, they try to build something. In a sense that can dialogue, and then we go back to Franco at this point, can dialogue use form that can be problem solving? Can they not? Well, that is an open question, but it's clearly, whereas in Dublin we don't see any, well, at least I didn't see any attempt to answer to this question. I see that Valéry, and then we see in Pavese, dialogue wants to do something more than be a rhetorical structure, being a synchronic dimension, well, expressing a synchronic dimension of time, or building something that is aesthetic but doesn't allow us to go beyond specific aesthetic and epistemological question, like what is the question of time in modernist aesthetics. And I see that, well, at least we can discuss about it, but I see that the Eupalinos and Gallico go to this direction, to this flowing of beats. Nothing flows in Dublin's works. They exist, but they don't flow. Then we go to the very end. So, Pavese and David Smith in reality, we go to, again, we go to a different dimension, I guess. Linguistically speaking, if you read Valéry, it's hard. In Dublin, you perceive this rhetoric, it exists. In Valéry, you perceive this very high philosophical language, on the one hand, but also you perceive this attempt to use a very sophisticated language. It's really cool. It's also very hard to read Pavese's text, but in Dialogue Coluco, reality comes into the text. As I said earlier, anyone in this room can be Calypso or the musician. Not all of us can be Phaedrus or Socrates. This requires a kind of a linguistic, kind of a philosophical background to embody one of these people. In Pavese's dialogues, we can be any of the characters because they move from these. The characters they become people. That's the attempt of Pavese. We perceive this multi-perspective nature of consciousness. They do feel, they perceive, they talk, they discuss, they change. They try to change. Some of them they don't, but they try to complete each other by discussing these biological structures. Just to briefly discuss, stated there are 27 dialogues, it's an igon in this in his Greek etymology between men, women, gods, and goddesses. But when you read Pavese's text, if you don't know anything about mythology, nothing about mythology, you can think that Calypso, as my American students think, they ask me, is this a real person, Calypso, or not? No, it's not a real person, but by the language they use and what they see and what they discuss, they don't have, they have these Greek names and we can connect them to the classical background through which Pavese built this text, but the language says something different. We face this polyphonic realism. Every character has a different realism. They try to build a different realism. It's a very polyphonic in a sense because they discuss and they change through the text and by discussing to each other. But their names are borrowed from the past, but they rooted in the present. In this sense, there is a very strong attempt to do this hermeneutics of myth in a temporal frame. Whereas in the Valéry's text, we can talk about this diachronic, that was the term that I was thinking about, in this diachronic temporality, or the diachronic scale, so from the present to the future, in contrast with the synchronic plane of Dublin's Gespräche. In Pavese's lyrical book, we perceive this transhistoricity of time. We have archetypes. We can read. We can read. We have these archetypes. They go back and forth in the text in each character, and they are transferred into the present, in our own present, and they embody and represent two different visions of the world. One is the holy one, and the other one is the titanic knowledge. One is the law of the gods, after Zeus came to life, but came to rule life, and the other one is the previous knowledge, and the previous law before Zeus came to rule, which is the titanic knowledge. So the violence, the knowledge of violence, against the knowledge of the law. These two dimensions are strictly connected to each other. Pavese doesn't deny that the one exists and the other one doesn't. They are connecting and they merge with each other in this present, and then try to go from the past to the future. We can see and perceive a continuity between these two dimensions. which is completely denying Löwing's work in his Gesprächsstruktur. Whereas in Pavese, I think we can see this fulfillment of the dialectics in this sense, from the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis by means of time. As the matter says in the Mistero, everything that men touch becomes time. And the goddess, they want to have the same perception because they don't have the perception of time. That's why they care so much about the man, because they can give them a different idea of life, which is the temporality. Of course, the men would love to live forever and don't perceive pain, etc. But they have the perception of life because they live through time, which the goddess and the gods cannot. Existence in the dialogues of the Muse is all made of these elements, the immanent elements, and also the mortal elements, the transhistorical elements, namely the merging between this immanent and immortal dimension. A good example to sum up this dimension is that we cannot kill them, the monsters. This pre-Apollonian knowledge of the world exists, and it's part of us, and we cannot destroy it. It's part of us, and we have to reduce reason to know, to see clearly, in order to make something out of it. Because the gods they perceive that this knowledge existed, they try to erupt it from reality, because it's exactly the opposite of what the Apollonian law wanted to do. But it's something that is completely part of human condition, or as Pavese wrote in his essay in Mito, it's part of poetry, and in the sense of dictum, not necessarily about poetry itself, but literature in a sense. There is this mythical germ that exists and points in both directions. And the only way through which, not Pavese, but the dialogue, the literary dialogue itself tries to do is to use this double temporality in order to point to both directions. In this sense, knowledge is not just a form of perception of reality, but also, as I said earlier with Valérie, how to build a new reality. Root and End, being in 1910, kind of trans-historical way also to look at it. I think we are still in this 1910 dimension with this crisis of the self, and we still how we do with this crisis of representational forms, and of course of language. Another way to look at these dialogues is to look specifically of the language, the French, the German, and Italian, to see how the rhetorical structure changes and how language is used in order to represent the reality. First point. Second point, it is an epistemological problem because language points to a reality, and we have to see what kind of reality does the language point to. And the third point, so these text titles, try to build, in all of them, a new ontology after the crisis, and what kind of ontology do we have, and if we have an ontology, if we do believe in ontology, and how these temporalities that come from this new idea of being can be defined. As I said, I think it's in a free way, this synchronic, diachronic, and transhistoric temporality. And to sum up, I think it's grounded in dialogue, grounded reality in and with antiquity. By that I mean that in all the dialogues that I read in the 20th century, those rooted and grounded in classical antiquity are not necessarily the best in terms of aesthetics, but in terms of forms of producing knowledge, they are those who were trying to really deal with this epistemic, aesthetic, and ontological issue. With that, these are my 2 cents to the topic. Thank you for your attention, and